So when we're looking at emotional intelligence and emotional health and well-being, what we're looking at is the ability to feel and experience all emotions. And that doesn't mean that we only ever have happy, content, calm kids. That they're going to, if we're looking at having an emotionally healthy child, they're going to experience a range of emotions, just like we will experience a range of emotions.
Welcome to Peds Doc Talk TV and this episode of the Peds Doc Talk podcast, where you can catch my amazing conversations with guests on the show here on my YouTube channel, or if you prefer audio only, wherever you access podcasts. I'm Dr. Mona Amin, a board-certified pediatrician, lactation consultant, and mom of two, and I'm here to uplift, support, and guide you so you can raise those incredible kids. Let's get to today's amazing conversation. Today's guest is Alyssa Blask Campbell. She is the CEO of C.E.P. She has a master's degree in early childhood education and is a leading expert in emotional development who travels the globe speaking on various topics. Her podcast, Voices of Your Village, is a gathering place for parents, caregivers, teachers, and experts, creating a modern parenting village, and reaches listeners in more than 100 countries. She co-created the collaborative emotion processing method with Lauren Staubel, an assistant professor of early education and mindfulness consultant, an approach that changes the way adults experience children's emotions so we can respond with intention and raise emotionally intelligent humans. Their research of the C.E.P method and experiences as educators and parents is shared in Tiny Humans, Big Emotions, which was published last October of 2023 from HarperCollins. Thank you so much for joining me today, Alyssa. You have been a busy woman, because I didn't even mention this, that you also had a baby recently alongside of writing a book. So thank you and welcome to the show today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm jazzed to get to hang out with you.
Yeah, and we are chatting about tantrums. Every parent wants to talk about tantrums, and we're talking about tantrums from your perspective, understanding, navigating, and regulating the emotions underneath. But before we get into that, tell us more about yourself, the inspiration of your book, and also maybe the inspiration behind Seed and Sow.
Yeah, so I have a master's in early ed, and I am a mom of two now. And I had found when I was teaching in early ed is a huge focus on social emotional development, which is awesome. Super rad that we're talking about SEL, social emotional learning. And also, in my experience of it, there was a huge focus on social development. How do we get kids to show up with certain skills socially? How do we get them to be empathetic? How do we get them to collaborate? How do we get them to be kind, etc.? And there wasn't a lot around how do we help them build tools to notice what's happening in their body, to know how their unique nervous system works, to know what calms them, to know what dysregulates them, so that they can show up with intention, so that they can access things like self-control and be able to choose their words and speak kindly to somebody or engage in social play. And so a lot of the expectation was this social component without the how do you build the emotional piece that is a predecessor for the social piece? And so Lauren and I were teaching together at a school that was really resource rich in the Boston area, where every head teacher of this childcare program had a master's in early ed, and we were attached to a university and had the opportunity to do research. And we created the collaborative emotion processing method to help guide us through what does it really look like to build emotional intelligence. And spoiler alert, of the 5 components, 4 of them are about us as adults, and what we're bringing to the table and how we are showing up and our own tools for regulation and acknowledging our biases. I wrote in the book that sometimes I open my mouth and my mom comes out, and sometimes that's great, and sometimes I'm yeah, I totally want to pass that on. And sometimes I've spent a lot of time in therapy trying to not pass that on. And so where do you go from there? What does that look like? So diving into the practicality of this and recognizing that we don't have a spare 20 minutes to work through emotions, or kids aren't hey, mom, is this a good time for you? And so really building in the what does it look like to do this work in real time was what led us to the C.E.P method and our research. And then from there, when our research ended, I started Seed and Sow to be able to just share about this work in a broader sense. And then eventually we, after gathering all the data and all that jazz, wrote Tiny Humans.
Love it. And congratulations again on the book. And we're going to be
Thanks.
diving into, again, tantrums, which are just obviously a part of, their emotional processing and awareness. And I cannot wait to dive into this, an area that I also love chatting about. I love talking about tantrums, de-escalation, but also, like you said, getting into the ability to teach that child how to tap into what they're feeling. I know I've been on your show as well, talking about really getting into the why and the feelings for a child. And so I think it's just so important. And so we're going to talk about tantrums. I know everyone listening, really get the book too. We're not going to be able to tell you every situation, how to manage every emotional situation your child may go through. But I guess I want to start with one of the biggest misconceptions you feel parents have in regards to tantrums that you would love to debunk or sort of clarify with some nuance today.
Yeah, the biggest misconception is that you're failing if they're happening. That like
Yeah.
there's a perfect way you could set everything up so that your child doesn't have a tantrum. And that's not true and it's not real. And I think it's also one of the challenges, like I'm going to put this in quotes, but like parenting experts on social media is that there can be this perception that if I said everything right, if I did everything right, in quotes, then my kid wouldn't have a hard time, wouldn't have
Mm-hmm.
that tantrum. And that they would just be like, "Hi, mom, I'm feeling really frustrated and I want to talk through it. And can I have a hug?" And that's not real. And so I think that first and foremost is that like if your kid's having tantrums, that is a very healthy, normal part of development, and you're not failing for that.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And, I hear a lot about the preparation and what can we do. And not to say that that's not important, right? Because we can take a
Totally.
child and say, okay, I know that my child is going to have more meltdowns if they're sleep deprived, if they're hungry. We know the basics, right? And I know your resources and mine as well talk about that. But I love that you're normalizing that because that also can lead to that unmet expectation. And I see that all the time when parents come in my office, they're like, well, I was told that if I do this, then this would be how it shows up. And I'm like, well, your children are not robots. So you can try. And I don't think we should not try. But I also agree with you that we have to also know, what am I going to do now that they have that moment? And first part of that, like you said, is not have self-shame of like, well, I must have not, so I as a parent failed them because now they're melting down in the grocery store or on the plane and I didn't do everything right. And that is met with guilt. I mean, it's not a fun place to be. And then you're more likely not to really manage that tantrum as you probably would because you're approaching it with self-shame and embarrassment, if you will.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also it's not a part of emotional intelligence. So when we're looking at emotional intelligence and emotional health and well-being, what we're looking at is the ability to feel and experience all emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that we only ever have happy, content, calm kids. That they're going to, if we're looking at having an emotionally healthy child, they're going to experience a range of emotions, just like we will experience a
Mm-hmm.
range of emotions. And I had a parent who reached out a little while ago and they were like, "Oh, they've been trying this other program." They're like, "And it's just not working." And I was like, "Well, let me know what you mean by not working. Like, what's your goal?" And they were like, "Well, we're still like every time I set a boundary, there's pushback, there's whatever." And I was like, "What's your goal there?" And she was like, "It would be so nice if I could say, 'Hey, we're going to do this,' and they would just collaborate." And I was like, "Totally. It would be
It
so
would
nice."
be.
And it's their job to push back. And they're not going to be like, "You know what, mom? I can see that you have my best interest at heart when you set that boundary. Thanks for keeping me safe and healthy. And now I'm ready to listen." And it's that's the expectation there has to shift. And for me, it's also that like I want to let kids know that you do get to feel all these feelings.
Yeah.
And they only learn that by practicing feeling them.
Yeah, and they only learn these things by being in those moments, right? Like I think a lot of what I've seen in the community, especially on social media, is a fear of going into situations. And now I understand there may be some nuance in case, like, a child may have some sensory issues with an environment, but barring any sort of that, right? Like I'm using the example of flying with a child. I
Mhm.
dreaded flying with a child because I didn't want to do it. It was not something that was enjoyable for me. And yes, you don't have to love flying, but the more I did it, exposure therapy, the more I realized that it's going to be okay, and that people will have comments if your child is not behaving quote unquote correctly on that flight, and that's no reflection of you, and that's just more of a reflection of them. And now I enjoy flying with my 4-year-old. I mean, it's one of the most enjoyable experiences. I want to take him everywhere. And the only way that Ryan, my son, could have really learned about what we do on flights and what how we're going to be in these situations is by exposure. And so taking your child to the store, letting them have that feeling of a meltdown if they don't get a cookie, navigating those feelings, navigating the moments in public is really useful information for everyone. So a child can just, again, learn. And I love that. I love that we can teach our child so much about the range of emotions. And I love your resources for a reason, because you really do understand that range, but also the nuance and sort of, yeah, it's a mixture of preparation, but it's also a mixture of, well, what are we going to do now that it's happening? So I love that.
Yeah, the proactive versus reactive. We go into that a
Yes.
lot in the book. So much of my work is about the nervous system, right? So we dive into the 8 sensory systems a lot, recognizing that every single one of us processes sensory stimuli differently. And so what is going to be dysregulating for some folks might be regulating for other
Yeah.
folks, etc. And so much of our work on the both proactive and reactive side requires us to understand the nervous system a bit. And we'll look at things like, for instance, my 3-year-old is sensory sensitive. He
Yeah.
is incredible at noticing details. He can tell you if there's a lawnmower 3 houses down. He knows exactly how clothes feel on his body, if they're too tight, if they're too itchy. He is really aware if something visually changes, if something isn't in the same place that it was before. He's really good at noticing details. He has a heightened system that can pick up on these details that my sensory systems often miss. So,
Yeah.
like my visual system, I am like the annoying partner who walks by the pile of laundry over and over, and I just don't see it. I'm not like purposefully not taking it upstairs. I just genuinely don't see it. And my husband, who's like my son, is like, how do you not see it? Because that's how their nervous systems work.
Yeah.
And so when we're diving into this work and we're looking at how do I support them proactively, how do we consider it setting them up for success? How do I set them up for success? What it's going to depend on who your child is and how they process the world. For my little guy, he does really well with pre-teaching, so knowing what to expect. He does not like to be surprised by things.
Yeah.
He even likes at home if like we keep our front door locked so that somebody has to knock if they show up. Like if somebody just walks in the house, even if it's Nana, who he loves and sees all the time, he wants to know before they come in. And so letting him know like what to expect from something, but also providing sometimes accommodations, like you can bring your headphones to this, or if that snowsuit feels too tight, you could take this sweatshirt off and try it.
Mhm.
And giving him other sensory options to help ease the sensory experience a bit. And then what we've learned about him is we often hear of our 5 senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell.
Mhm.
And then we dive into, in the book, the other 3 senses: interoceptive, which is what your nervous system is feeling inside. So if you say like, I have butterflies in my stomach, you know that feeling of like nervous or excited, or those internal cues for having to go to the bathroom or being hungry or tired. That's the interoceptive system. And then we have our vestibular system. This is our movement sense, and it helps us balance and move through the world. And it is, we can recharge it with things like swinging or going upside down or spinning around. And so our proprioceptive sense is located in our muscles and our joints. You might see this with like big body play, kids who are jumping off of things, or that they love heavy work. Think like CrossFit for kids, where they like carrying things, right? Or we might see siblings where like one sibling loves to like push another sibling around in a laundry basket or something like that to get that heavy work in. And so when we are looking at these sensory systems, there are some of them that we're going to be sensitive to and some that we are going to be seeking that are regulating for us. I am more sound sensitive. So if I'm already feeling dysregulated, if I'm hungry, if I'm tired, if I'm overwhelmed, then you add on sound to it. Like for me, like tapping or clicking sounds, which is so many kid toys, I feel like make like
Yeah.
tap. I'm like, oh my gosh. And it can crawl. And then I want to explode. And then I'm not the parent I want to be. And what's regulating for me is often like proprioceptive input or touch. So I could have a massage for like 4 straight days and still be like, oh, I want more. And it's hard for me to get touched out. In fact, one of the things that's really calming for me if things feel really busy is to slow down and just have Mila, my baby, just nap on me in a carrier.
Yeah.
That is comforting for me and calming. And for my 3-year-old, he is sensitive to most of the first 5. He also has a sensitive interoceptive system. He's really aware of how things feel. He can go 0 to 1,000 when he's hungry or tired. He feels things really deeply and in a big way. And he is vestibular seeking. I'm vestibular sensitive. So if I spin or I like on a swing for long at all, I get nauseous. It's uncomfortable for me. He could live on a swing. It's so regulating for him. And so when we're looking at this, in order to know, like, how do we proactively support them and then support them in the moment, it's key to understand who are they and how does our nervous system work. And so one of the things that we did at Seed, we worked with an OT, an occupational therapist, to create a quiz to help you understand your kid's nervous system a little bit. It's free. You go to seedquiz.com and it's a series of questions that'll then help you understand your kid's sensory profile and give you some ideas of activities or ways you might see things show up. If people are interested in that. But so for Sage, for instance, my 3-year-old, if we're going to go to, say, a restaurant where there's going to be a lot of stimuli, it's going to be loud, there's going to be a lot going on around him. Eating is a sensory experience in and of itself. Like all that jazz is going to happen. I know I've got to proactively support him. Sometimes we'll bring headphones or bring some accommodations, but sometimes we're also going to spin around. I'm going to play a game with him between the car and the door of the restaurant where I can either dip him upside down or get some spins in, kind of like twirls. We're going to recharge his battery a little bit with vestibular input before we then go into a space where his battery is going to be drained.
I love this. Interoceptive, vestibular, and proprioceptive, because again, going back into the science and the differences of temperament and who a child is. And that can also be a form of preparation, like we talked about. And also, I'm assuming those 3 things can also help in the middle of a tantrum as well.
Correct.
You knowing the identity or who your child is. What do you think is a mistake parents make in the middle of the tantrum? And also, how could we use the 3 things that you mentioned in the middle of a tantrum with an example?
Yeah. So one mistake is, I think the most common one is just trying to make it go away, right?
Yeah.
Which makes sense because big emotions are inconvenient and they're uncomfortable and it's hard to be around them. And yeah, it's really hard to hold space for them. They're not usually at convenient times. And so, but it's like quicksand where the more we try to make it go away, the more we kind of sink down into it. And so when we can allow it, when we can hold space for it and move through it, which we walk you all through in Tiny Mystic Emotions, then we will have, it'll actually dissipate usually sooner. But when we're looking at what do we do in the moment to help them regulate, because for us, there's a difference between sensory regulation and emotion processing. You can get back into a calmer body and still feel mad or sad or
Yeah.
frustrated. You can get out of a space where your body's in fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode, where you're maybe flailing and screaming, and still be within emotion and then go through emotion processing. And that's what we're looking to do. So I don't want to rush the feeling away. We're not going to like goodify it and like, you're okay, this is fine. Like, nope, it's not fine. I understand that you're frustrated. Like all that can be true, and we can help them get into a body that feels more in control for them. And when we're looking at this, knowing your kid's sensory profile is huge because I love touch, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
when I'm having a hard time, if somebody offers me a hug or touches my body, it's calming for me. Sage is touch sensitive. And so if I give him what I need in the moment, it's dysregulating for him.
Yeah.
When he's having a hard time, if I put my hand on his body to offer a hug or even like a gentle, like, hey, buddy, I'm here, he will flail and it's worse. It's more dysregulating for him. What's helpful for him is for me to get as quiet as possible, for my body language to get as quiet as possible. This looks like dropping down to the ground if I can, not towering over him, being mindful of my tone,
Mm-hmm.
where if I'm like, all right, bud, I get it. Yep, come on. Like that's different than if
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, bud, I get it. We got to keep moving, but I get it. Like if
Yeah.
I am mindful of my tone, his nervous system responds to that really well. And then if when he is ready for touch or if he's open to it, some vestibular input, like, oh, wow, if I can validate for him, like, man, you really wanted to get that at the store. And I said, no. So disappointing. I get that, bud. When you're ready, would you like to hear a story about a time where I wanted to get something at the store and Grammy said no? He's very into hearing right now about times where I have experienced this,
Yeah.
right? Lets him know he's not alone. He's not the only one who's ever felt this. I have felt this. I've survived the disappointment too. I know what it feels like, right? It helps him feel seen and connected. And in that meantime, I will let him know I'm going to be here with you. And when you're ready, if you want to, we can do some big jumps or some spins. And he'll usually be like, no, in the moment, right? Like yelling, no, until he is ready to accept that. Now, sometimes I have time to let him flail or have a hard time. And sometimes it's going to be further dysregulating for him. But sometimes I'm going to pick him up off the grocery aisle 4 and carry him out to the car and know that we're going to process this in the car or at home. And that it's okay if you don't go through all the steps in that moment.
I love your resource and I cannot wait to read the book more because you also brought up the fact that you are recognizing that you carry either similar or different styles than your children, right? You brought that up
Mm-hmm.
beautifully because I think we often forget that that mismatch sometimes, or even the similarity, can be difficult. And I also use that example because my husband is not one to want that physical touch, but yet
Mm-hmm.
me and my son, when we're dysregulated, need the hug, need the, what we do,
Mm-hmm.
people can't see it, is when my son's dysregulated, what really helps him is when I squeeze his arms really tightly to give him that input, right? That sort of, I got you. It's not even a hug. It's me
Mm-hmm.
squeezing down his arm and regulating him with that strong touch. And all of a sudden he just melts into like regulated mode. And my husband, that does not work for him. And so I love that you're providing that nuance and all of the science in your book and your resources, because I do feel oftentimes that we hear these blanket statements of, oh yeah, get down to their level, verbalize, offer the hug, but also we got to really flip it to the narrative of, are we looking at what that child may also need? Because we also know, and I know you know this to be true, over verbalizing for a child who does not like that is going to be more triggering. And sometimes we do
Mm-hmm.
hear that narrative about verbalize and empathize. Of course, you can verbalize, and what you just said perfectly with a tone correction, but sometimes it's about quiet and really
Say
bringing that
less.
down. Yeah, say less, because I've been there, the when you just keep talking, they're like, just stop. And I've been there as an adult too. If my
Mm-hmm.
husband was coming to me like, Mona, I see it. I get it. I hear you. It's so frustrating. I'll be like, yo, can you just stop talking and just sit with me? And like you said,
Yeah.
just sit and just be. And I think sometimes parents are uncomfortable with silence. and uncomfortable not being a fixer. And you go back to that with tantrums, right? They want it to end, or they want to be the fixer that, oh, I can help you get through it. But many times it's just not doing too much. And I love the way you talk about that.
Yeah, thanks. I think that we absolutely can overdo it. I think it makes sense to me. A lot of us grew up in households where no one talked to us about our feelings. So now we're like,
Yeah.
well, I will be damned. Like we will be talking about feelings and we will talk about them. And
Yeah.
there's a middle ground. There's a
Yeah.
balance here of like, yeah, we can talk about them for sure. And we can make sure they're welcomed and mentioned and that we're there for them. And when we're adding, also one of the things that I see a lot, and it's this fine balance where like people love when we put out scripts, when we say, here are things you could say. And I really try to balance this with like, but also find your authentic voice.
Yeah.
Because if you go up, example, I was crying, I was having a hard day, and I was crying in the living room, folding laundry, and Zach walks in, my husband, and he was like, oh, hey, you seem sad. And I was like, no shit. Is it the tears coming down my face? Right? Like, yeah, way to go, bud. Good detective work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but it felt like he was trying to say the right words,
Yeah.
right? Rather than just showing up as his authentic self and being like, hey, whoa, what's going on? Which
Right.
feels more connecting to me than trying to say the right words. And so if you're working from a script and your inside narrative is, this is really inconvenient and annoying, and I actually don't have empathy for it, but your outside words are, hi, bud, wow, you look really frustrated. Like, but those things aren't matching, then they're going to feel it from mere neurons way more than what the words coming out of your mouth are. And so just being mindful of that like, if you're not ready to talk yet, don't. Like, if you are in a place where you actually can't empathize and connect right now, give yourself a beat. And you can even self-talk this of like, oh, wow, I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now. We're in the grocery store and your body's on the ground and screaming and our cart's full of groceries. And I need to calm myself down to figure out what to do next.
Yeah.
Just give yourself and say it out loud. Like, let the kid hear, yep, she's overwhelmed and she's going to take stock of her own stuff. She's going to be accountable for her own regulation and she's going to figure out what to do next. I don't have to stop what I'm doing. I don't have to police my emotions. I get to still be a kid and have my experience and recognize that she has her own experience and is accountable for her own regulation. That I think can buy us time and also help us regulate ourselves while showing them that they don't have to get calm for us.
Yeah. Oh, I love this. So great. And, we've gone through that sort of prep that you talked about, and I'm going to attach the seedquiz.com because I do feel that would be so useful for everyone. That'll be in the show notes. And then we talked about in the tantrum. Now, what would be your biggest tip for after a tantrum, which I also feel is so important too. So how would you approach or tell parents to kind of remember when they are going after a tantrum?
I think after is the most important of the three, actually.
I agree.
That like, because there's going to be so many times where, you don't prep and things happen. There are going to be times where maybe you do all the prep and still hard emotions happen. And there are going to be times where in the moment you can respond with intention and times where you don't respond with as much intention. Like, all those are going to happen. What you do have the most control over is actually after.
Yeah.
So after, regardless of how things went down, being able to revisit. Now, the biggest mistake is revisiting too soon. It takes about 20 minutes for our nervous system to really calm once we start that process. And so if, this starts to calm down and 5 minutes later we tap back in and we're like, hey, bud, I'm so sorry for yada yada, they probably aren't ready to receive it yet. And so giving it enough time without waiting, days, where you can pop back over and be like, you know what? Earlier this morning when we were trying to get out the door, I was rushing and I was feeling overwhelmed. And I'm sorry that I yelled. I'm going to work on next time getting my stuff ready ahead of time so I'm not feeling as rushed.
Yeah.
That wasn't a kind way for me to speak to you, right? To be able to come back to that and we own our stuff, or even revisiting and saying, wow, I've been noticing that when we are getting ready for school and trying to get out the door, that it's been a really hard time for you. You've had a lot of big feelings. It sounds like it doesn't feel good for you. I want to help figure out what's going on and see what else we could do. When you go to put your socks on, if they do feel too tight, instead of screaming and throwing them across the room, I want to help you so that you can say, Mom, these socks feel too tight. Can we
Yeah.
find a different pair? And letting them know in the calm moments, like, here's what we can do and here's what we can work on. And it doesn't mean the next time this is going to happen, but it shows them, hey, it starts to bring some awareness to the situation and shows them, I'm on the same team with you. We're on the same team here. And I want to help you, and I'm not mad at you about it. We get to revisit and talk about them in the calm moments where our brains are actually able to receive this information. Because when we're in a dysregulated state, when you're in the moment, that prefrontal cortex shuts down. Our rational thinking brain shuts down.
Yeah.
And it's great. We should be in a reactive state. We want to be able to react when we need to. And recognizing that that's why it's not the time to have these big combos about what to do differently. It's why in the moment when a kid hits somebody, saying, hitting hurts, we're not allowed to hit in our house, we X, Y, and Z, isn't actually helpful because they're not choosing hitting. They know
Right.
hitting hurts. They don't want to do this in the moment. Their body's out of control. Having those conversations outside the moment, really helpful. Hey, bud, I know that hitting hurts, and I know that you're so kind, and I believe that you don't want to hurt your sister. I want to help you figure this out so you can make a different choice next time. We can come back to this afterward. And sometimes some sensory input here can be helpful too, especially in navigating these conversations, because it's uncomfortable to have hard conversations. You might notice some discomfort arise, kids being like, I don't want to talk about it. And letting them know, like, yeah, that makes sense. It's uncomfortable to talk about hard things. I'm wondering if you're feeling embarrassed about what happened or feeling guilty. That makes sense. And it's okay to feel those things. And you're like with the deep squeezes of the arm, like this might be a time where maybe I'd have this conversation with Ryan when he's sitting in my lap. And even before I start having the conversation, I'm going to give him just some gentle squeezes. I'm going to give some of that input proactively before we even start the conversation to pour a little bit into his nervous system.
Well, I love that you've already normalized so many expectations and manage people's expectations, because we've already spoken to that at the beginning about going into a tantrum and how some people feel like, well, I'll do all this preparation. But you just said beautifully about the repair and the discussions after, giving the 20 minutes, but how the goal isn't that, okay, next time you're in this situation, it's going to go swimmingly. Because I think that is a mistake, an unmet expectation of a lot of parents, my husband included. He was like, well, he should know this. We've talked about this. I'm like, he's 3.5, 4 years old. As they get older, the repetition and as their brain develops, it starts to kick in. But I don't want you to ever abandon it thinking that's not working, right? I think you probably see that too. People feel like, well, I talked about it, even an hour at bedtime, and they still did that behavior. So it's not working. I'm like, you have to trust the consistency. I think a lot of times parents abandon the consistency in a method that is, working like this, thinking that, oh, I didn't get that quick fix. I didn't get that kid who all of a sudden, oh yeah, sure, Mom, let's do it.
Well, it's not how any of us work, right?
Exactly.
And I think of this kind of like reading to kids. I don't read to a baby expecting them to read back to me tomorrow. I read to a baby so we can build these foundational skills that they're going to need to read back to me in 5, 6 years.
Right.
And so if I said like, well, they're not reading yet at 2 and stopped reading to them, I'm abandoning a lot of foundational skills that they're going to need at 5 and 6.
Yeah.
When we're doing this work, we're building skills they're going to take with them for life. And they're going to continue to fine tune these skills and hone these skills, but it's not something you see change in overnight. And no one on the planet has access to all of their skills all the time. That I know for myself, like, I know how to be kind and respectful and connected in conversation with my husband when I'm in a regulated state.
Yeah.
If I've had a long day and he walks in after work and I have a kid on me crying who needs to nurse, and I have another kid who's like, I'm hungry, I want to eat now, and I'm feeling whelmed, and Zach asks me a question and I turn and I snap and I'm sarcastic and snippy and whatever, it's not because I'm choosing that. right?
Right.
I'm not like, you know what, this is going to be the most productive way to interact with Zach right now.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
that's not the case. What's
Right.
true is that I don't have access to all of my skills all the
Yeah.
time because when we're dysregulated, we don't have access to everything. Just like when you're tired, it's not a great time to do like conflict resolution. And so recognizing that that's true for kids too. They might
Yeah.
have a skill that they can access sometimes. It doesn't mean they'll have access to it all the time.
And oh gosh, I love talking to you because I just feel like um, a lot of times we hold children to a higher standard than we hold ourselves, like what you just described, right? You and I both. Like I've had those moments where I snap, and like you said beautifully, it was never intended. I don't want to be the snippy wife that is overstimulated and snaps when I know that that's not the way to communicate. And our children are much younger than us, still a developing brain, and yet a fully developed brain that me and you hopefully have still, and a lot of our
Mm-hmm.
listeners still, we struggle with that. So how can we expect a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 year old to have all the coping skills and ability to understand that and having more grace for ourselves and them too? And I love that
Yeah.
you tie in the neuroscience and obviously the development and normalize that in your resources in your book, because I think this is so key for children, for parents to understand the why, so that they don't hopefully get as frustrated in these moments, because like you said, it's a work in progress. And I see it, you see it, it works. I mean, it's a lifelong process, but you will see it pay off in terms of like, wow, my child actually gets it and that's cool. But
Yeah.
don't worry if it's not happening right away.
Yeah. I mean, I've been doing it since Sage was born, and I've been doing
Yeah.
it for myself and in my marriage before Sage was born. And just recently at his third birthday party, he came up and said, Mama, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I think I need to go
Yeah.
inside and take a break. And I was like, awesome. Right. And like,
Yes.
that is it working. It's my
Yes.
goal isn't that he never gets overwhelmed. It's that when he gets overwhelmed, he knows he can ask for a break and what tools help him calm. And that's 3 years in the making,
Yes.
right? Like, and so if you're starting wherever you are, however old your child is or you are, like now's a great time to start, like it's never too late, but it's never too early, and know that it takes time to hone these skills and to build them. And it's never going to be done with perfection. I've never left the day as a parent or a teacher and been like, wow, I was perfect today.
Yeah.
I navigated everything perfectly. I was always regulated. I always spoke exactly the way I wanted. No, it's not the goal. It's that we can do this more consistently, that we're not stuck in periods of dysregulation for a long time, and that we can turn more often than not to coping strategies which help regulate the nervous system versus coping mechanisms which numb our nervous system temporarily. Those are two of our real big goals here.
I love it. And that story about your son, and when he said that, we had that moment too. And I remember turning to my husband and saying, hey, he recognized that feeling and he told me that it was too much. Or for that situation,
Mm-hmm.
that was that light bulb moment of, we're doing it, that we're doing it, it's
It's
happening,
working.
was when Ryan said, yeah, exactly same thing. Like, I'm feeling frustrated, like use that term because we've talked about
Mm-hmm.
frustration. And he's like, I need your help. And I'm like, thank you. You recognized you were frustrated and that you couldn't do it. And rather than saying, I do it, which is a completely normal developmental thing, you asked me for help, which is what I've been trying to put into your brain
Yeah,
for years. And you did it. And it feels good. And I love what you said, that it's always possible. And I wish more adults would learn that, right? I mean, I have adults in my life, let's be honest, that I
same.
wish could say more. I'm feeling a little frustrated right now. I need to take a moment. I'm not naming
Mm-hmm.
names, but it exists. And
Sure.
oh my gosh, like, and I look at my 4-year-old who has more emotional understanding than some adults I have in my life, and I'm like, we're doing it. And so it's never too late. I love that message. What would be another final message for everyone listening today?
Yeah, it's so funny because we had a chapter of the book that was taken out because my editor was like, listen, we could keep this in, but you say this every sentence. So I think they get it. And I probably said it a million times here, but it's consistently going to be my message. There's no perfection. There's
Yeah.
no perfection in this. And I think one of the things that we're seeing over and over is that when parents or teachers or caregivers are navigating rupture, when we respond in a way or we react in a way that doesn't feel good inside for us, that then we're carrying guilt and shame for the rest of the day. or days or weeks or months. And it becomes a part of like, oh, I am a yeller. I am a whatever mom. And it becomes a part of this identity and narrative we have about ourselves. And a part of emotional intelligence is going to be that rupture and allowing guilt. Guilt's a beautiful emotion that tells us when we are outside of our values. And when we can tune in and say like, ooh, that didn't feel good. I'm feeling guilty. Great. Then you get to navigate repair. And the key is that when you navigate repair, you've done enough. And now when that guilt pops up, you get to be like, yep, thank you for letting me know I was outside of my values. I am going to work on that going forward. I'm good here.
Yeah.
And just that's it. It's enough to do that.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure having you on. I love chatting about this. I love learning about your book and obviously the motivation behind your platform and the book as well. Where can people go for more information, learn more about the book, and also just to stay connected with all of your resources?
You can find me at Seed and Sow. So seed.and.sow, SEW, on Instagram, on Facebook, seedandsow.org is like the mothership. And we have Voices of Your Village podcast. So we drop an episode every Thursday. You've been on the podcast, and it's just a place for us to hang. I go live every Tuesday on Instagram from 12:30 to 1, where I just do live Q&A, just hang out with the community and answer questions. So if you have more questions, you want to dive into things, pop on over to the live and we can hang there.
I love it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
This was an absolute pleasure. I loved connecting with you here on your show. It's just such a really great thing to, talk about children in a positive way. And I mean, you literally just spent a whole half hour, whatever we did, talking about tantrums in a positive light, which I think is so healthy for parents to hear. So I cannot appreciate you enough and the work that you do. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Mona.
Thanks for tuning in. If you love this conversation, make sure to hit that thumbs up sign, share this episode on your social media channels, and subscribe to this channel to stay up to date on all future episodes and our weekly educational videos. Have questions or comments? Make sure to comment below, and I'll see you all next time. Stay well, stay loved, and keep on shining.